Lieutenant Richard Bong's P-38 Lightning shivered violently as cannon shells from a pursuing Japanese fighter ripped into the left engine cowling. The airframe vibrated like a struck tuning fork, and the twin-boom fighter lurched sideways as metal fragments tore free. At 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, Bong was isolated in a sky that suddenly felt far too big. His wingman had already vanished beneath the clouds in a spiraling trail of black smoke, leaving him alone with a predator on his tail. The August 1943 sun blazed across the cockpit glass as Bong forced the Lightning through another savage banking turn. But the Zero behind him held the position like it was tied to his tail by an invisible rope. Every evasive maneuver he threw at the enemy. Barrel rolls, brake turns, scissors, dives, the Japanese pilot countered with cool, practiced precision. The Zero crept closer, its white fuselage gleaming like a hunting shark in open water. Bong had been trained by America's best instructors. He knew every defensive move the manuals had ever printed. None of them were working. Warning lights glared across his instrument panel like angry red eyes. The damaged engine's oil pressure was plummeting. His airspeed was evaporating, and his altitude was bleeding away faster than he could compensate. In 10 seconds, maybe less, the Zero would have a perfect firing solution. With the Zero settling perfectly at his 6 o'clock, guns ready to deliver the finishing burst, Bong realized he had run out of conventional options. Training said one thing. Survival demanded something else. In a moment of raw desperation, he did the only thing that made sense to a man moments from death. He flipped the P-38 completely upside down, pointed its wheels at the sky, and slammed the control stick forward into a maneuver instructor swore would kill a pilot instantly. The Lightning knifed downward in an inverted freefall, screaming toward the Pacific upside down. Bong's vision flooded with red as blood surged violently into his skull. The cockpit blurred. Loose shell casings and pencils floated upward, slamming into the canopy overhead. The twin Allison engines howled in protest as negative G-forces twisted the airframe. For 2 unbearable seconds, Bong flew blind, guided only by instinct and the hope that death was a few seconds slower than he feared. But when Bong rolled upright again thousands of feet lower, what he saw, or rather didn't see, would spark a tactical revolution that no one in the Pacific Air War saw coming. When Bong finally muscled the P-38 upright at 12,000 feet, his lungs burning and his eyes throbbing with burst capillaries, he scanned the sky in disbelief. The Zero that had been seconds from killing him was gone, vanished as if ripped out of the air by some invisible hand. No tracer fire, no silhouette, no sign of pursuit, only empty sky and the distant glimmer of the Pacific below. He circled cautiously, adrenaline still spiking through his veins. Fighters didn't just disappear. Not fighters flown by veteran Zero pilots. Something had happened in those 2 seconds of blind, inverted freefall, but he didn't yet know what. All he knew was that he should be dead, and somehow, impossibly, he wasn't. What Bong didn't realize was that his desperate gamble had exposed a weakness the Japanese had spent years hiding behind superior maneuverability. The Zero was unmatched in tight turns and climbing battles, but it was never designed to handle negative G-forces. When a Zero pilot rolled inverted and pushed forward into a dive, its lightweight carbureted engine starved almost instantly. Fuel sloshed away from the intake. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died. And a dead engine meant a dead pilot. American fighters, by contrast, had been built with durability and raw power in mind. The P-38's fuel-injected Allison engines didn't care if the plane was upright, sideways, or upside down. They kept feeding fuel no matter how violently the aircraft moved. That technical detail, overlooked by most pilots before now, was the key to surviving against an enemy that outturned and outclimbed anything America put in the sky. But this wasn't just a mechanical advantage. It was a psychological earthquake. For more than a year, the Zero had ruled the Pacific skies like an airborne tyrant. American pilots had learned to fear the white-painted fighter that could twist inside any turn and appear on your tail before you even realized you were in trouble. Yet here was Bong, the same man who moments earlier was seconds from death, now realizing the Zero couldn't follow him into this inverted escape. And this wasn't luck. It was physics. Negative G-forces, those brutal upward-pulling forces that turned Bong's vision into a red haze, were something an American plane could survive, but a Zero could not. The Japanese pilot behind him likely tried to follow, only to watch his engine sputter out while his target plummeted away at impossible speed. Bong hadn't escaped by skill alone. He had escaped by exploiting the one realm the Zero couldn't enter. And this discovery wasn't Bong's alone. Another American pilot would soon test this maneuver deliberately, and what he found would shake the entire Pacific theater. The breakthrough Bong stumbled into would have remained an isolated miracle if not for Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, a man already respected for surviving missions others didn't return from. On April 7, 1943, mere months before Bong's near-death escape, Lynch found himself in a situation painfully familiar to every American pilot in the Pacific. Alone, separated from his flight, and bracketed by multiple Japanese Zeros eager to finish him. The ambush unfolded over the Russell Islands. 8 Zeros dropped from the sun in a coordinated attack that splintered Lynch's formation instantly. In the swirling chaos, Lynch's wingmen vanished behind clouds and smoke trails. He was left alone at 20,000 feet with enemy fighters spreading around him like wolves circling a wounded animal. Lynch had fought long enough to know exactly how this story usually ended. But Lynch refused to die the conventional way. He understood something few pilots yet accepted. Fighting a Zero in a turning battle was suicide. His P-38 was fast, rugged, and heavy, but it simply couldn't win in a horizontal dance. And if he tried to run straight, the Zeros, holding altitude advantage, would pounce before he built enough speed to escape. His options were closing rapidly. Then, in a moment that mirrored Bong's desperate gamble, Lynch rolled his Lightning completely inverted and shoved the nose downward into a negative G plunge. Unlike Bong, though this wasn't a panicked last resort, Lynch wanted to see what would happen. The world flipped violently. The ocean rushed upward from above. His vision darkened at the edges as blood surged into his skull, and loose objects floated past his helmet as though gravity had been unplugged. Behind him, the Zeros tried to imitate the maneuver. That was their mistake. As they rolled and pushed forward, their ultralight airframes shuddered under stress they were never engineered to endure. Engines hiccuped. Carburetors gasped for fuel. One Zero's propeller visibly slowed. Another began trailing smoke, not from bullets but from internal failure. And in seconds, Lynch was accelerating away while his pursuers stalled helplessly in midair like birds struck by an unseen force. At 12,000 feet, Lynch rolled upright, pulled back hard, and used his surge of momentum to rocket back skyward. Now he held the high ground. He dove on the struggling Zeros from above and shredded one before the pilot even regained engine power. When Lynch landed later that day, his face was speckled with hundreds of tiny blood-red dots, burst vessels from the negative G-forces. His eyes were crimson, and his head throbbed. But he had survived, and he had proven the impossible maneuver worked. And when Lynch shared what he discovered over drinks that night, the tactic began spreading like wildfire, but not through official channels. That night, Lynch sat beneath a dim tent lantern at the squadron's makeshift bar, still rubbing the ache behind his eyes. Younger pilots gathered close, drawn in by the quiet intensity of a man who had cheated death more times than he cared to remember. He didn't brag. He didn't dramatize. He simply described what he had done, and what happened to the Zeros that tried to follow. The tent grew silent as the implications settled in. The unstoppable Japanese fighter had a blind spot. At first, the rookies rejected the idea. They'd all heard the warnings in stateside training. Never push into an inverted dive unless you wanted to black out. Rip the wings off your aircraft, or plummet into the ocean. It was the kind of maneuver written off as suicide in aviation manuals. But Lynch stood in front of them, alive, calm, and sipping a tin cup of weak island coffee. His survival was the only proof anyone needed. Word spread quickly, not through official briefings, but through the same underground network of fighter wisdom that had kept pilots alive since the dawn of aerial combat. In foxholes, in mess tents, in the shade of palm trees beside muddy runways, veterans whispered the same advice to the newly arrived. If a Zero locks onto your tail, roll inverted and dive. They can't follow. The odd thing was, flight surgeons began noticing something. Pilots who survived using this trick often returned with burst capillaries across their cheeks and foreheads, looking like someone had splashed red paint across their faces. Many complained of splitting headaches lasting days. Some admitted to momentary vision loss in the middle of the plunge. But for every pilot who walked into the medical tent with red eyes and a pounding skull, another pilot walked in soaked in seawater, because he hadn't used the maneuver in time. The surgeons documented everything: negative G side effects, temporary blindness, disorientation. But not once did they recommend stopping the tactic. They understood the stakes. A few headaches were nothing compared to the alternative result: a flaming spiral into the Pacific. And so, unofficially, the inverted dive became standard survival lore. Not written in manuals, not authorized by brass, but passed from survivor to survivor like a secret handshake. By mid-1943, American pilots no longer entered combat resigned to the Zero's superiority. They had a trump card now, one born not from engineering boards or top brass strategy, but from two pilots who refused to die by the book. The Zero still dominated turn fights. It still climbed like a hawk. But now, when it latched onto an American fighter's tail, it wasn't the end. It was an opportunity. But understanding the Zero's weakness was only half the story. Soon American tacticians would weaponize this discovery into a strategy that rewrote the Pacific Air War. While the inverted escape spread informally from pilot to pilot, America's top tacticians were wrestling with a bigger problem. How do you beat an aircraft you can't outturn, outclimb, or outmaneuver? Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, a brilliant strategist and former schoolteacher, had already begun cracking the puzzle. He studied the Zero obsessively, dissecting its strengths and weaknesses until patterns emerged. The Zero excelled in slow, turning dogfights, so Thatch reasoned, don't fight it that way. Thatch had already invented the Thatch weave, a clever defensive rhythm where two American fighters crisscrossed to protect each other from a pursuing Zero. It saved countless lives, especially for Wildcat pilots early in the war, but it wasn't an offensive weapon. It allowed Americans to survive, not win. The inverted dive, however, unlocked something new. It proved the Zero had a flight envelope it couldn't enter, a hole in its seemingly perfect armor. Suddenly, the idea of taking the fight to the Zero no longer seemed impossible. As pilots shared their experiences, squadron leaders began piecing together the broader truth. American aircraft were sturdier, faster in dives, and far more tolerant of brutal G-forces. They could shed altitude like a falling anvil, then rocket back into climbs fueled by massive engine power. The Zero, meanwhile, was fragile, lightly armored, and easily pushed beyond its limits. If the Americans stopped trying to fight like World War I turn fighters, everything changed. Soon, the inverted escape became the opening move in a new style of combat. Pilots were told, if a Zero gets behind you, don't fight, bait him. Roll inverted, dive vertically, and let the laws of physics do the rest. Once the Zero stalled or peeled away, the American fighter would bottom out, pull into a zoom climb, and reappear above the Japanese pilot with the sun at his back and guns perfectly aligned. Killer became prey, prey became killer. Flight instructors didn't officially endorse it yet. Manuals still warned against inverted dives, but squadron commanders weren't waiting for Washington's approval. Colonel Neil Kirby of the 475th Fighter Group reportedly addressed his pilots with brutal honesty. Turn with a Zero, you die. Climb with a Zero, you die. Use speed. Use gravity. Make him chase you into a place his aircraft can't survive. These weren't tactics drawn from theory. They were carved from the lived experience of men who'd escaped death by inches. By late 1943, the culture of American air combat had transformed. Pilots no longer entered battle hoping to match the Zero's elegance. They entered knowing they could break it apart, mentally and physically. The tide was shifting, and the Zero's reign of fear was beginning to crack. But theory is one thing. Turning the tide of a war requires proof, and soon, the Americans would put these new tactics to the ultimate test in the bloodiest skies of the Pacific. By late 1943, the Pacific skies had become a brutal proving ground where theory lived or died in seconds. Over the Solomon Islands, American pilots began putting their new understanding of the Zero's weaknesses into practice. Not through official doctrine, but through instinct, word of mouth, and the raw urgency of survival. Every mission felt like a test. Would this new way of fighting actually work when bullets started flying? It didn't take long for proof to arrive. During bomber escort missions over New Georgia, P-38's flying cover found themselves repeatedly bounced by Zero fighters diving out of the sun. What once triggered panic now triggered opportunity. Instead of turning to meet the attack, a move that guaranteed disaster, American pilots rolled inverted and dove as a unit. The Zeros, attempting to follow, immediately began to stall or lose engine power. For the first time, American fighters weren't just escaping, they were dictating the engagement. Captain Robert DeHaven of the 7th Fighter Squadron was among the first to score a confirmed kill using the inverted dive tactic. A Zero slipped behind him during an escort run and opened fire. Instead of turning, DeHaven flipped his Lightning upside down, shoved the nose forward, and vanished downward like a stone dropped from the heavens. He kept eyes on his mirror and watched the Zero's propeller begin to slow. Engine failure. The Japanese pilot was helpless. Moments later, DeHaven's zoom climbed back up and shot him down cleanly. Stories like DeHaven's spread like wildfire. Pilots who had once dreaded facing Zeros now fought with a new swagger. They discovered an emotional shift just as important as the tactical one. Confidence. For the first time since the war began, American flyers didn't feel like prey. They were learning to weaponize their aircraft's strengths, speed, durability, and diving power, while exposing the Zero's hidden flaws. The psychological tables were turning. The Japanese pilots sensed the change too. In debriefings collected after the war, several surviving Zero pilots recalled the shock of watching American fighters vanish in inverted dives that no Japanese aircraft could match. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected aces, described the frustration of lining up a perfect kill only to have the American plane flip over and drop away, as if gravity itself had changed allegiance. Every attempt to follow ended the same: a dead engine, a stall, or a loss of position. Soon, the Zero's aura of invincibility began to crumble. The same skies where Americans once died by the dozens were now filled with Lightning, Corsair, and Thunderbolt pilots hunting with newfound purpose. The inverted dive hadn't just saved pilots, it had flipped the Pacific Air War on its head. Yet the inverted dive was only the beginning. Soon American aircraft themselves would evolve, and the Zero would face opponents it was never designed to fight. By early 1944, the inverted dive had already rewritten the rules of survival, but something even more devastating was happening beneath the surface. American aircraft, once outclassed by the Zero's agility, were undergoing a transformation. Newer models, refined engines, and combat-tested upgrades meant that U.S. fighters were no longer just surviving. They were beginning to dominate. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, suddenly found itself aging in a war that demanded evolution it couldn't match. The P-38 Lightning, already feared for its speed and diving power, became even deadlier with improved turbo-superchargers that let it claw upward through tropical air with startling ferocity. The F-4U Corsair arrived like a punch to the jaw. A massive radial engine strapped to sleek, gull-shaped wings, capable of dive speeds the Zero simply couldn't survive. And then came the P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug, a hulking brute of a machine that could shrug off punishment that would rip lighter fighters apart. Each of these aircraft brought something the Zero couldn't match: raw, overwhelming power. The Corsair dove so fast that its controls stiffened near the speed of sound, something Zero pilots never even approached. The Thunderbolt could outdive practically anything in the sky and emerge from attacks like a flying anvil. And the P-38, already the spear point of America's Pacific strategy, became the ultimate energy fighter, using altitude, speed, and brutal vertical maneuvers to dictate every engagement. For Japanese pilots, the shift was terrifying. The Zero's greatest advantage, its unmatched turn rate, mattered less and less as Americans refused to engage in horizontal dogfights. Instead, they fought vertically, using gravity and horsepower to smash into combat from above. Every time a Zero tried to climb or maneuver into a firing position, the heavier American fighters simply dove away, then returned moments later with lethal speed and the sun at their backs. Worse still for Japan, its industrial base couldn't keep pace. The Zero had been designed with revolutionary early war technology, but it was built atop a fragile foundation. Lightweight construction, no armor, minimal fuel protection, and engines that choked the moment negative GS hit. America, with its limitless factories and engineering departments, was upgrading its fighters faster than Japan could replace lost pilots. The Zero wasn't just losing the performance war, it was running out of time. And the pilots flying these new American aircraft were no longer the green trainees of early 1942. They were hardened, experienced, and armed with tactics like the inverted dive that shattered the myth of Japanese air superiority. The predator-prey dynamic was reversing, and soon the Zero would face its worst nightmare. American pilots who not only understood its weaknesses but exploited them with mathematical precision. But machines and maneuvers alone don't win wars. Soon, American aces like Thomas Maguire and Richard Bong would take these tactics and turn them into legendary kill streaks the Zero simply couldn't stop. With new tactics and superior machinery, the Pacific skies became the battleground of legends. Among them stood two names that would echo through aviation history: Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire. These weren't just pilots. They were predators who mastered the art of energy fighting, inverted escapes, and the brutal vertical warfare that turned the Zero's strengths into liabilities. What began as survival maneuvers evolved into deliberate, calculated hunts, and the aces leading the charge were rewriting what American air power meant. Bong, later crowned America's top-scoring ace, treated the P-38 like an extension of his own instincts. He had a gift for reading the sky, anticipating an enemy's move before it happened. When he performed the inverted escape, it wasn't desperation anymore, it was strategy. Bong often baited Zero pilots, intentionally flying just slow enough to tempt them into attacks. The moment they committed, he rolled inverted and plunged. Every Japanese pilot who tried to follow entered the negative G-trap that crippled their engines. Bong would reappear moments later above them, guns aligned. Thomas Maguire, competing closely with Bong for the title of America's top ace, used the tactic with a colder, more analytical precision. He understood better than almost anyone that the Zero could be manipulated into self-destruction. In one encounter over Leyte Gulf, Maguire deliberately flew in a straight line just long enough to convince a Zero pilot that he had the kill. When the enemy closed to firing range, Maguire flipped inverted and dropped away like a falling star. The Zero followed and tore itself apart under negative G-stress. Maguire didn't need to fire a single bullet. For pilots like Bong and Maguire, the inverted dive wasn't a trick. It was a weapon. They mastered the vertical game, diving with savage speed, then using their momentum to zoom back upward into perfect firing angles. The P-38's concentrated nose-mounted guns allowed them to unleash devastating bursts with pinpoint accuracy. Zero pilots, once confident in outturning their opponents, now found themselves hunted from above by aircraft they couldn't outdive or outclimb. And while Japanese aces were undeniably skilled, men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Tetsuzo Iwamoto, their machines trapped them. They flew aircraft that punished negative G maneuvers, tore apart under high-speed dives, and offered no armor when American .50 caliber rounds found their mark. As veteran Japanese pilots were lost, inexperienced replacements entered the skies with only minimal hours of training. Facing American aces who had mastered the inverted dive was no contest. It was slaughter. By the end of 1944, Bong had secured 40 confirmed kills, and Maguire had 38, numbers that would forever cement them as legends of aerial warfare. Their mastery of vertical tactics and negative G escapes wasn't just personal skill. It was the culmination of everything American pilots had learned about defeating the Zero. The skies no longer belonged to Japan. But the impact of the inverted dive wasn't limited to dogfights. Soon even bomber crews were adapting the maneuver, and the Zero's dominance crumbled on every front. By late 1944, the inverted dive was no longer a secret weapon reserved for fighter aces. Its influence seeped into every aspect of aerial warfare, even among bomber crews who were never meant to perform violent maneuvers. Heavy bombers loaded with explosives and fuel couldn't execute full negative G plunges like a P-38 or Corsair, but crews quickly discovered that partial inverted rolls and steep breakaway dives were enough to throw pursuing Zeros off their tail. The Zero's fragile fuel system simply couldn't keep feeding the engine once negative pressure took over. During escort missions over Rabaul and New Guinea, bomber pilots began improvising maneuvers their manuals never imagined. When Zeros latched onto the trailing aircraft, often called the tail end Charlie, the bomber pilot would roll partially inverted, push forward, and let the aircraft drop in a jarring negative G slump. The maneuver was crude compared to the fighter's full escape, but it worked. The pursuing Zero's engine sputtered or lost fuel pressure long enough for turret gunners to fill the sky with .50 caliber fire. Bomber crews began reporting something incredible. Zeros were breaking off attacks before closing to firing range. Japanese pilots, once fearless, were now hesitant to commit to prolonged tail chases. Many had learned the hard way what happened if an American bomber suddenly dipped or rolled at the wrong moment. Their engine coughed, their airframe trembled, and the bomber's gunners tore them apart. The psychological tide had shifted so dramatically that even heavily armed bombers now felt like predators when the moment was right. Meanwhile, American fighters, now fully committed to vertical warfare, turned air superiority into a science. Pilots stopped thinking in terms of turning battles and started thinking in terms of energy states: altitude, speed, dive potential, and attack windows. They treated the sky like a three-dimensional chessboard, forcing the Zero into positions where its weaknesses became fatal. The inverted dive wasn't just a trick anymore, it was the entry point to an entire doctrine built on gravity and momentum. Japan tried desperately to respond. Engineers rushed out new models like the Ki-84H-8 and J-2M Raiden, fighters with stronger engines and better high-speed handling. On paper, they could challenge the newer American aircraft. But the reality on the front lines was grim. Shortages of high-octane fuel crippled performance. Replacement pilots received rush training measured in hours, not months. And even the improved fighters still suffered from fuel starvation under negative G conditions. The physics that doomed the Zero were baked into an entire generation of Japanese aircraft. By late 1944 and early 1945, the Zero's dominance was a fading memory. Exhausted Japanese pilots flew outdated machines into a sky now ruled by American aircraft designed for speed, durability, and violent maneuvering. The inverted dive had exposed a fault line in Japanese aviation, and from that crack, the entire myth of Zero invincibility crumbled. But the true legacy of the inverted dive wouldn't be written in combat reports. It would echo into the jet age, shaping fighter doctrine for decades to come. By the final months of the Pacific War, the inverted dive was more than a battlefield trick. It had become a symbol of how innovation in the heat of desperation could alter the course of history. The Zero, once feared for its ghost-like agility, now struggled against opponents who understood exactly where its limits lay. But the impact of this discovery didn't end with the fall of Japan. The lessons born in the Solomon Islands would ripple forward into every era of aerial combat, shaping how future generations of pilots thought about speed, energy, and survival. After the war, aviation tacticians pored over combat reports, gun camera footage, and first-hand testimonies. What they found confirmed a new truth. Turning fights were no longer the future of air combat. Speed, altitude, and energy, those were the real weapons. The inverted dive, brutal and counterintuitive, had exposed the limitations of dogfighting doctrines still rooted in World War I. American instructors rewrote training syllabi, embedding vertical maneuvering into every lesson. Fighter pilots were taught to control the energy state of their aircraft like a resource, saving it, spending it, and exploiting it at the perfect moment. This new philosophy guided pilots into the jet age. In Korea, F-86 Sabre pilots used vertical dives and energy tactics against MiG-15s, refusing to enter turning contests where the enemy excelled. In Vietnam, F-4 Phantom and F-105 pilots leaned heavily on momentum, high-speed slashing attacks, and disengagement dives, tactics that directly descended from those desperate P-38 maneuvers over the Solomon Islands. Even the creation of the U.S. Navy's fighter weapons school, Top Gun, sprang from the hard-won realization that understanding energy management meant the difference between life and death. And yet, the story always circles back to Richard Bong, the man whose moment of terror became the spark for a tactical revolution. Despite surviving the Pacific with a record 40 victories, Bong never saw the full influence of what he'd done. On August 6, 1945, the same day Hiroshima was bombed, Bong was killed while test flying the new P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet. The timing felt impossibly symbolic. The ace who mastered World War II skies died on the day the world crossed into a new era of warfare. Today, Bong's restored P-38 Lightning stands in the National Museum of World War II Aviation. Its polished metal reflects the faces of visitors who stopped to read the placard describing the maneuver that once seemed suicidal. Nearby, preserved Zero fighters remind onlookers of a sobering truth. Even the most dominant machines have weaknesses waiting to be uncovered. History's turning points aren't always forged in boardrooms or laboratories. Sometimes they are born in a split-second decision, made by a terrified pilot with nothing left to lose. The inverted dive stands as a reminder of a deeper principle. Wars are won not just by better equipment, but by the creativity and courage of the people who use it. The Zero didn't suddenly become weaker. American planes didn't magically grow stronger. What changed was how pilots thought, how they embraced unconventional solutions, defied their manuals, and trusted instincts forged in the fire of combat. A maneuver once deemed impossible reshaped the very nature of the Pacific Air War, simply because one man dared to try it. And that is the true legacy of the inverted dive. Proof that sometimes history doesn't turn because of what a machine can do, but because of what a human being is willing to attempt.